So when I was thinking about what to talk about for the presentation, I was thinking to myself, I want to talk about how do we categorize different genres, and what does it mean when we talk about, speculative, when we talk about realism, and when we talk about reality, for example. And as I'm kind of packing up my books out of my office, I was thinking, how do I even put these kind of books on the shelves? How do I actually even just take them for my own personal use? As I'm kind of a nomadic existence being an academic, I'm always like having to pack up my books, take them somewhere else. And it's just this constant recategorization of my kind of literary cohort that always comes with me, which is always very heavy and annoying, but at the same time is always brilliant because I'm always creating these like different ways where they create conversations on the shelves. So I'm always creating these little kind of annexes for them. And I'm always really careful about how I do that, like even on my own shelves. And what I realized I also do is I randomly assign these little piles all over the house, so they follow me when I'm like thinking about things. I'll just kind of be like, oh yeah, but these books go together, and then they just kind of pile up on surfaces like around my home and around my office. And then I'm like, yeah, I'll come back to that later. And then sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. So that's just to me my own academic exercise in how I do like categorization. And it got me kind of thinking about that doing this presentation. It's like a very physical way of doing it, but it's how I've always done it. And then I was starting to think, okay, like when we talk about speculative, what do we even mean? Because there's some classic examples like Nnedi Okorafor's Lagoon. And, a lot of people have classified that as sci-fi. Some people classify it as African Futurism. She herself talks about the definition of African Futurism. But what's super interesting about this novel is that she was inspired to write it by a real life newspaper article about a swordfish attack. So the opening of that novel, as many of you have probably read, is that a swordfish punctures an oil pipeline off the coast of Nigeria. And she saw this headline and thought, that's a great story. I'm going to make something of that. Another example comes from the Down Days from South Africa. And Hugo's The Down Days was published just as the pandemic happened. So this had already gone to the publishers. There was no kind of tip-off that this was going to happen, and yet it is quite close to reality in some ways. Okay, the virus there was this uncontrollable pandemic of laughter, but there's many things in the novel that we can correlate with reality. And what's super interesting is there's a line in that novel that says the virus was like one big blender that liquefied everything. And the down days, that's the pandemic, have upset the balance of things, which is exactly what the global pandemic did for us. So you can see there's always this interplay of reality and speculation and irrealism. Also in novels like The Famished Road and also, for example, Charlie Thompson's Rosewater trilogy. These are classified as quite different novels. One of them's often classified as magical realism. The other one is quite hard sci-fi. But still, they have these elements of looking at coloniality. So you see in The Famished Road, the dad in the novel, he has these dreams where he sees, people drowning in poverty. There's a war, and people are always preyed upon by other powers. This manipulation by the Western world, our history and achievements rigged out of existence. And then in the Rosewater trilogy, there's also a much more forceful kind of conversation about colonization by aliens. And it says, don't you know we already have experience with this? We already know about first contact. This new colonization of aliens is nothing new. So again, these conversations are based in reality. These genres are based in reality. So how do we then define genre? Genre has many facets, I would say. And it's a way of just categorizing memberships of groups of texts. I don't want to go into too much detail, but this is how I would kind of divide examples of that. So you could do that through medium, that's like oral, textual, virtual mediums of texts. Texts could also be oral or they could be written. You could have different forms, so the novel versus the short story. Then, of course, we always have the habit, which is you can argue for and against. How can we geographically categorize text? So, well, we have this saying about world literature, which I'm often not always a fan of, and also global south, which I'm definitely not a fan of. But then we have the category of African. What makes an African text? What makes a Nigerian text? What about linguistics? What about languages? What about Afrophone texts? What about texts from Nigeria that are in English? You know, these all have different categorizations and they're different genres or different canons. Of course, genre is also defined through its audience and it's also defined through its publishing market. Quite often a text will, because texts are popular by certain readers, the publisher is looking to categorize it as something that they can sell or they can make audiences understand. So, for example, at one point, magical realism was very popular, and now African futurism and African sci-fi is quite popular. So again, where those what would have been categorized as magical realism probably 20 years ago is now being recategorized as sci-fi, depending on who you speak to. And which market you publish in. So it is also a marketing choice or a marketing fact. And then, of course, styles of fiction, non-fiction, magical realism, sci-fi, futurism, irrealism, surrealism. It's endless. It's really endless. But I think the thing I really want to focus on today is when we talk about genre, whose reality are we talking about and what realisms are we talking about? And what is the use of genre in those kind of realities? Why do we need it? Why do we need to overcome certain types of categorization in terms of taking power over our own realities? And just a quick quote from Karen Barber, who says, "We cannot ignore genre because of its relation to history and social context." So exactly how I'm saying, there is a construction of genre by the audience and by publishers and by academics and by authors themselves. So, and that also just by historical and social aspects. Sorry, I'm not used to this computer, it's new, so I'm flicking through things. Which way am I going? Then what makes speculative fiction? That's also a tricky category. I also prefer the term speculative fiction personally because it is so fluid. So we can encompass many things within speculative fiction. It could be magical realism, it could be horror, fantasy, sci-fi, alternative histories, all sorts of different types of futurisms, whether it be Afrofuturism, African futurism. So that's something that I find particularly interesting, is this fluidity. Another definition has often been that it actively speculates. It is a critical analysis of the past, present, and possible future. And it often needs to analyze or discover something. It needs to explore. And of course, when we talk about African context, I find the African Speculative Fiction Society's definition most helpful because it is also very broad. So if you go to their website, they have this great page, and I find that really useful for just also thinking about what makes an African text African. What is the problem of genre? Is often that texts from Africa are defined as unclassifiable. So by conventional Western genres, they are defined as ambiguous, or they're defined as we don't really know what this is. And then it could just be labeled experimental. This is obviously an issue because it risks this colonial appropriation of categorization of genre. And that's something I want to discuss a little bit further. And then we have to also move on to this kind of debate between what is realism and what is irrealism. So in the times that we're living right now, everything is, of course, how from whatever lens you look at it, whether it's, you know, global catastrophe, global politics, capitalism, the pandemic, we have moved into a slightly different era where as Mark Fisher always says and is quoted a lot, is saying it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is the end of capitalism. So where does realism actually get us? We have to ask, what is the point of realism, and is it really useful, actually? So this is an era where we're learning to live in the aftermath of all of these crises, where everything is actually collapsing and our current realities are degrading. So where can we look for understanding, for knowledge to overcome the systems that we're in? That one I've already talked about a little bit. And also just this idea that, of course, reality is different for different people. So there's this quote by Grace Sillen that says, for many communities, the apocalypse has already taken place. So someone's realism or someone's reality is not the same as someone else's. And how does this reflect in texts? How does this reflect in speculation? Now, I would say this is a list of also dominant realisms that speculation, in my eyes, also attempts to overcome. So it could be colonial realism, so the kind of power that has been instilled upon a society by a colonizer. This could be something that a text will try to negate. Capitalist realism, which I've just talked about with kind of Mark Fisher, techno-digital realisms, Cartesian dualism, so the way that we relate to ourselves, our body, our mind, so this embodiment, anthropocentric kind of thinking where we are dominant over nature. So that's like this idea of like, what is human, what is nature, the interrelation between the two. Sovereignty, of course, and also ideas of reason, ideas of decision making, which is also very important, I think, for understanding what is reality. So, of course, the dominant Enlightenment period mentality is that logic and reason are above everything else. But what about cultures that have different understanding of reason and rationality? So that's something also that needs to be talked about in speculation. So realism in text can often be seen as this discourse of power. It's an imagined world that functions using the same referential materials and acting as the same laws of our own, but we need to be aware that this is constructed on epistemic speculation, on the Cartesian tradition of epistemology. Sorry, I can't speak. However, it's reflections. Sorry, I've lost completely my train of thought. Sorry. So Shaw says that realism is basically creating an imagined world, but we must critically reflect on that it is constructed and it is based on Cartesian tradition, and that we are really looking at this fiction as real, but actually, of course, it is just speculation. So realism is never real. So what also traces this rise of realism as parallel to modern secular and materialist understanding of reality. African authors have a long history of calling for a shift in how writers address realism and basically this assumed universalism of reality. So examples of that by African writers kind of, writing back against realism or understanding of realism is J.M. Coetzee. He talks about this idea that we are lulled into this false sense of security, that it's a true construction of reality, but actually reality is indoctrinated with certain ideological tendencies that are hidden within realist modes of writing. And he argues that South African writing has been colonized by a discourse of history that presents itself as reality. And I have a publication or another essay that you can read if you like, and it's basically tracing his ideas of South African texts presenting themselves as reality and how speculation actually can counter that in South Africa as well. So, and of course you have famous also writers who have also talked about this idea of the binaries between the real and the imagined. So Nnedi Okorafor, for example, she really says, my novels are from the soil of the real, even though they're sci-fi, even though they're African futurist, it doesn't matter, they are from the soil of the real. And Ben Okri has very famously declared that his magical realism is just realism. So this debate has been going on for a very long time in African literary tradition. Going back to this idea of speculative fiction, this is also quite a famous quote by Walida Imrisha and Adrienne Marie Brown, who say that this is actually visionary fiction. It's from the real life experience of inequalities and movement building, and it creates new ways of understanding the world around us and new ways of interacting with each other. And this is really what speculative fiction should be seen as. It's a way to disrupt grand narratives. It's a way to demolish current systems, as I've been talking about. It's a way to organize new civic futures and incorporate alternative knowledges and epistemologies. And it could be that these stories create some kind of utopic or dystopic infrastructures or dreamings or imaginings, but what they actually do is disrupt our notions of what is real. So that's why they're so important. So they're basically always questioning our habitual notions of the world, and they allow actually us to experience our realities differently. So we can read a book and then we will relate ourselves to that book later. So we are coming away and what Wendy Ferris calls defocalization. It's another kind of focalization of reality, another representation of reality through speculation. And I have two case studies to give today. One is this idea of like petrofiction or oil literature from Nigeria. And the second one, I talk a little bit about autofiction. So as many people probably know here in the audience, there is a long history of petrofiction, which is fiction relating to oil from Nigerian writers. There's obviously the kind of more autobiographical accounts. There's many texts which are playing with realism and irrealism. And Jennifer Wenzel, she talks about these fictions in terms of petromagic. So these are ways of understanding both irreal elements and material elements of oil politics, of the political ecology in Nigeria. And Watts talks about kind of this understanding of oil as mythic, magic, and national properties of oil. This is something that goes from the notion of oil itself, so this imagination that oil can change everything, that oil is a way out of poverty, all the way up to the magic of the nation state, that the state has sovereignty. So everything is diffused by this kind of sense of this myth, basically, of oil. And this is a structural violence which then gets perpetrated in the nation. And Michael Niblett argues that irrealist elements within texts can be understood as how violences saturate how violences are saturating the text. So this is basically how violences reorder everyday practices, ideologies, forms of labor, and these are imposed by imperialisms. And basically these become lodged in texts. So even if a writer isn't consciously writing about that, although many are, the kind of oil myth really gets put into the text. And I actually want to talk about three examples that are not, again, going back to this idea of like, what is genre? These are texts which are not always defined as magical realism or sci-fi, for example. So basically we have Oil on Water, which is, The Fisherman, first of all, that talks about this idea of, it talks about Niger Delta region, and there's a prophecy where there's two brothers and one is doomed to die. So again, there's like a prophetic element in there, which is bound up with the myth of oil. And in Cain Agari's Yellow Yellow, basically the idea is that there's the main character who really believes in this fairy tale of oil, that if she becomes comfortable in this elite lifestyle, funded by her friend who works in oil, and basically she wants to get a sugar daddy. And I won't spoil the ending, but of course it's not a fairy tale. It doesn't end well. Doesn't end with a happily ever after. And then Oil and Water has this Edenic island where the inhabitants are discovered by journalists as having managed to escape influences and pollution of local oil companies. So even though these texts are not what are classically defined either as magical realism or even petro-magical realism, or they are not defined as irrealist, they do have these irrealist elements, or these or you could even say other elements of realism that are not mainstream ideas of realism in them. So again, it's playing with this idea of genre and fairy tale and myth that gets perpetrated by the oil violence. And then my second case study today, I want to just quickly talk about autofiction. So what is autofiction? It's basically a fictional, what's defined as a fictional account, but based on also someone's experience or autobiography. So the writer often plays with their real life and then takes that and writes that in the text, but it's not always exactly how their life has gone, or not everything is factual, for example. So it plays with this idea of genre of what's real and what's not real in terms of the autobiographical. I'm not going to ruin this book for everyone because I know it's only just come out, but I would say this is one of the best examples. So I'm not going to give too much away because I could talk about it forever, but I think, so Nnedi Okorafor published recently The Death of the Author, which is fantastic. And she previously had published Broken Places, Outer Spaces. If you read them in tandem, you can see, and she does say that also Death of the Author is based on some real life elements, and she actually got persuaded by her daughter to publish it. I think I read in a news article, and she was a bit worried about how people would really look at this idea of what her real life was and how they would compare it to her life. Because it is about an author, but you don't know who the author is. That's the interesting thing about the text. And it has two titles. It's called Rusted Robot and Death of the Author. It's very, very clever. And it plays with this idea of what's real, what's not real, what's the past, what's the future, what's the present. It's very, very a very good example of autofiction. But like I said, I won't go into it too much because I know a lot of people might not have read it yet since it's just come out. Yeah. Then I wanted to talk a little bit about Freshwater and Dear Centurion. So these are really good. These are two really great texts by Maisie. If you haven't read them, Freshwater is based on her life experiences, but it is technically classed as non-fiction more. And then she wrote this memoir, and you can again read them in tandem and you can kind of compare them. So basically, she identifies as the author. Amazing. She identifies as Obanje, which is basically this idea of a spirit that reoccurs in Igbo culture. So again, so the baby, so a child is born, and then they basically keep getting reborn, reincarnated. And in Freshwater, there's this play of the spiritual world, and the main character goes on this journey to understand themselves. And then in Dear Centurion, they're actually talking about their own experience of their own reality, actually. So this idea of being a Banje, but also being gender fluid or trans. So this idea that gender is, after all, a human thing, they say. And for example, that this text came to them for a while, Freshwater. So this is them writing about Freshwater, where they basically suppressed this idea of writing it because their education had been westernized, and they weren't sure how to consider themselves spiritually Igbo, and how valid that was, because the legacy of colonization had basically taken away this reality for them. So the book is about exploring that. and about different realities, inhabiting simultaneous realities, which is very interesting. And these are some quotes from Freshwater. You can again read them in tandem. So in Freshwater, it says, I am here and not here, real and not real. So again, this idea of like living in different kinds of realities. And then the world in my head has been far more real than the outside one. So again, questioning what is reality, whose reality, and which reality do you actually have to adhere to, which I find very interesting as well. And what I find also specifically interesting about this idea of like autofiction and speculation is that this idea is speculation as community. So Amaze says, for example, that stories can be truer than facts. And often repeatedly in the kind of books, they say, I'm bending my own reality and I will make it reality. And there's another quote that says, I don't know any books by African writers who answered any of the questions I was looking for. I started my book because I had a slew of questions about trying to figure out who I was, rooting the process in Igbo reality, and my own archive excavating my own self. But I continued with this because it was a reflection for those of us living in shifting realities, world frames as madness, bordered by unknowns. So it's again resisting something, it's again resisting this idea of what is reality for many people, but what about people whose realities do not coexist well with the mainstream reality, which I think is, also a very prominent topic at the moment, considering a lot of politics going on. So, and then they say also this allows me wary hope that this space will be made for writers of colour working in experimental ways, because again they don't want to conform to genre. They don't want to say this is my way of writing. They don't want to say this is particularly speculation or this is particularly realism. So it's very interesting that actually in Dismantle, and they actually really write back to this idea of I can do whatever I want, actually. Even though I'm seized by 1,000 fears, we can make strange and wonderful things simply for the sake of it. And we can create without permission, we can write into the unknown. So it's this celebration of playing around with what is real and what is not real, what is speculative, what is realism. I'm just checking the time. Okay, we have a tiny bit of time. So just some really quick conclusions then from the two kind of case studies. The main premise of what I wanted to say in this lecture is that speculation is something that encompasses other or multiple realisms or realities. But basically, at the end of the day, speculation is lived abstraction. And it also looks at whose futurity do we have control over. So genre is a tool, but it can also be a weapon. So we have to be very careful about categorization. We have to be careful about who categorizes. And I think that's the main kind of takeaway I would like to give in the talk today. Also genre as what I would say is a practical imagination. This is from Bobina, who talks about this idea of decoloniality and that there's a delinking from the rules of the game. We need to have resistant texts which take back power and kind of deassemble systems of oppression. And I think this is something that speculation is either consciously or unconsciously doing in the way that it is written. And also going back to our other conclusion about genre as community, again, this idea of whose reality are we looking at, and creating communities of people who have a different reality or have a different understanding of reality, or have some kind of, or who also want to live through different ways of shifting realities. So I think that's really, really important as well. And then lastly, I would say, going back to the idea of how should we talk about genre, and that's we should be moving away from this categorical kind of element of trying to really define what genre is, and instead genre should just be seen as this shifting conversation. This idea of genre as a knowledge database, so something that has cascades, it has ripples, it has outlets, it has cross references to each other. It's not just a singular thing, it's not static. And And I go back also to Bold, who says that we need to keep things fluid, open, and recognize this value that we have here of it being actually a strategic identity, which I think is a really wonderful thing to say about speculative fiction. And thank you. That's all of my points.
Thanks, Michelle, for that wonderful presentation. There's quite a lot there going on, but I will open it for questions. So if you have a question, we are a small group, so probably easier to unmute and say the question directly to Michelle. So over to everyone. If you have a question, please.
Maybe I can just look at you guys instead of I have my.
Yeah. So as we wait to for others to come up with the question, I just want to revisit this idea of decolonizing genres, particularly when it comes to African speculative fiction. It seems the pendulum is not shifting from what you are presenting today, and so is the realism perspective along the same lines, particularly when you touched on the South African text. Would you like to sort of unpack that a little bit more for us?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure. What was your direct question? You want me to talk a bit more about what is realism, or who has control over the categories, or?
No, so this is linked to what it came through the presentation. I can't remember which slide, but it was about looking at decolonizing the genre. So maybe you can unpack a little bit more. And then you went on to talk about the South African text that, is still affected by a little bit of colonization there. So I wonder whether you can unpack that a little bit more. Maybe I'm not putting the question correctly.
I mean, what I mean by decolonization of genre is just to not stick to static categories of like something being sci-fi or something being like magic realism, but understanding that text can have different elements. So when I think the example that I was really using for that is the Nigerian examples where actually there's a lot of like what are traditionally seen as realist texts, but they have irrealist elements in them, but they also don't necessarily need to be defined as irreal simply because people like Ben Okri say, actually, this is real, this is our reality, because even though you define it as mythology, we don't. This is, mythology is our reality. So again, you have to turn this on its head. And you need to read like through the lens of different cultures, different religions, this kind of thing. And I think also there's a lot of literature on that through like animism. So like Garuba talks about this, and also Atu Quaison, and this idea that basically there's this trend to demarcate African fiction often as animism or in animist trends. But of course, like, magic isn't always magic to certain people. So how can we understand that? But actually, it's just a way of understanding things that are happening around us. So the thing that gets talked about a lot is this idea of how violence then gets talked about in text, and it's just a different way to understand violence. So you could talk about witchcraft, for example, in many societies. It's just a way of talking about marginality. So you have to understand, like, there's just different lenses to look at things, and just because one person's reality is not one thing, is said to be one thing, doesn't mean there can't be another truth to that. So I think that the way that we look at binaristic versions of irreal and realism needs to be looked at. And what I'm trying to understand is this like correlation between the two outside of fiction, and then how does that also trickle back into fiction? And then, of course, we're always confined by things like publishing houses, about how we're taught as academics to define text as well, which I find particularly challenging. And like I was saying, I'm just always like categorizing things when really, why shouldn't I be looking actually more at the output of text? What are they actually doing? And that's why I like looking at speculation as really like a tool, and as like a method rather than a category. Yeah, I hope that helps a bit.
It does. The restrictions on where to publish and how to go about publishing does affect quite a number. I mean, it affects my area of specialization as well. So yeah, it's a good answer to the question. Now, I see, Paulina, you have your hand up. Did you have a question or comment?
I have a question. Wait, can you hear me?
Or both?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. No. New headphones. Thank you, Michelle. By the way, amazing talk. So, but coming back to the decolonizing genre, and you said, okay, it's quite clear, right, how you would do it in maybe publishing industry, or how you would approach it in academia. However, like as part of this project, we're specifically focusing on STEM, like STEM MM or STEM BA education, right? So this more open understanding of reality presents a clear conflict with the many aspects of the STEM curricula, right? So it's both an opportunity, right, to kind of use this, like going from decolonizing the definition of a genre to questioning kind of like hidden structures within STEM education as well. So yeah, do you see how can you maybe explore how this could be applied within the STEM, since you also have a scientific background as well as a literary one, as I know?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Thanks for the question. Obviously, that's a really important question. I mean, there's so much work being done on this. Like, I have to say, like, at the moment, my own work is looking at I'm writing a book on insects. So I'm looking at how do people write about insects in texts? And of course, that's not always scientifically, but it's interesting to see how the authors have maybe researched insects and then used them in texts, or whether they look at mythology on insects. So I'm always looking at I'm always end up looking like between kind of like science and then like, science pages on these insects. And then I'm always looking at the novels as well. So it's really, for me, I'm always have one foot in each, I guess, in each thing. But of course, like there's many projects going on. Maybe we can call it like science fiction prototyping, scenario planning through more speculative narratives. Like those things are really going on right now. I know there's been a great project going on in Malawi on that. Your guys' projects have all, of course, are also going on. And, so there's like this idea that if we if we're looking at kind of narrative, what does that mean? What is included in the narrative and what is included in the knowledge base to make decisions? So there is, I think, like, you can look at all the theory, but there's lots of like real actual examples of informing policy. Andrew Merry was also doing one on sustainable futures and oceans as well. So there's like a lot of stuff going on with people who are really interested in how do we talk about decision making? Do we need to talk about it through the realist structures of talking about that, or can we imagine something and then use that imaginary scenario or narrative to then make a decision? And then, of course, you're then bringing in different people. You're bringing in policymakers, you're bringing in scientists, you're bringing in experts, and I say experts like in quotation marks, but you're also bringing in people who have a great knowledge, other knowledges of the region. So whether that's in mythology, or whether that's just, or whether that's agricultural, for example, or a combination of the two, it creates decision making a bit more kind of laterally, and talks about, again, who has access to knowledge, which I think is the most important thing. It's not necessarily what is real and what's not real. It's who has access to knowledge and who gets heard in that room as well. So I think that's what I would kind of probably say to you. I don't know if that answers your question, but I hope it gives you like the basis of an answer.
Paulina, does that? I think it does. It does answer the question and the linkage between what we are trying to do, and so the marriage between science fiction and STEM. Your response really endears to that. Thanks. We have another question. We have another hand up. Sam, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Michelle. I thought that was really interesting to hear about. So yeah, I think this builds nicely on the previous question and what you were saying around scenario planning, which is, I kind of work in, and the different knowledges and different types of knowledges and realities that come into that. I wonder what you think about the question of legitimacy and how different knowledges and realities might be perceived as more or less real when they are integrated within, I don't know, let's say a more sort of scientific speculation, like a scenario planning exercise, as opposed to a fictional exercise, and how we can ensure that different types of reality or different types of knowledge are perceived as equally legitimate within that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I knew you were going to ask me this. But like when I saw your hand was raised after Paulina, I knew. Because we know each other, so I was like, oh, okay, I know what Sam's going to ask me. So such a good question. It's something I always wrestle with in my work because, of course, like my background is working, like you, Sam, in kind of this idea of like environment and development. And then now I work in literary studies. And sometimes I think to myself, like, I work on this basically the same thing, but it's how legit do people think I am, which is also like what people think I'm crazy when I say to them, oh, I study sci-fi. But then when I say to them, oh, but my background's environmental, they seem to like somehow grab onto that. And I always wonder why. I find it really interesting because I feel like the work I'm doing now versus the work I did at the start of my career is not really much different to each other. It's just a different lens, and a different way of talking about things. And it's still both doing very legitimate, very like work in the real world, but just in a different way. And with regards to your idea of legitimacy, I think that really hits the nail on the head of like, what do people think is legitimate and what do people not think is legitimate? And I think this is something I don't necessarily have I'll be honest, I don't have 100% of an answer to you, to make people, more accommodating. But I think that is part of the decolonial project. And it is also part of the project of really thinking about where can we blur the lines of knowledge and coming away from science being, traditional science being the only way to make decisions or the mainstream way of making a lot of decisions. Because I think and I think also we have to think about marginalization and we have to think about what's going on in the world right now. So many people are facing a reality that's becoming really, really narrow. And if you don't adhere to that one way of being, that one way of doing, then you're basically becoming marginalized or you're at risk. And it's becoming so much more obvious and so much more worrying. And this is where I think that the work needs to be done. And so I don't have the answer, but I have the fact that I think people are doing that. And I think especially in speculative fiction, these authors are doing that work. To legitimize knowledge, and to write about different styles of knowledge making. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I think the question of legitimacy is a good one, and you've quite expounded it quite well. And I mean, speculative fiction could also play around with, people's own imagination of the same legitimacy.
Exactly.
But particularly when trying to put together scenarios for the future, whether I'm doing this for life cycle assessment or I'm doing it for something else. So I think it can't really play around with the imagination of people. But thank you very much for the question, Sam, and thank you for the robust response, Michelle. We have another hand up. Casella, do you want to have a go? We still have plenty of time.
Yeah, if I can unmute myself here, maybe.
Yeah, unmute yourself and maybe we can also see you.
It's not letting me turn my camera on for some reason, so I'll just go ahead and ask. So this is, I really enjoyed the talk quite a bit.
Thank you.
And this is a question about that idea of trying to think of genre more as a conversation, getting away from some of the rigid taxonomy. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how to approach that shift practically, materially. I'm coming at this, I work in book reviews and criticism, book selling. Obviously, publishers have pretty rigid categories. Things have to go a certain place on the shelf. But I'm just wondering kind of like, what are your thoughts towards pushing that more expansive, inclusive idea of what genre is into actual book spaces?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I mean, I don't work in publishing so much, but I work, I guess, in academia, which has the same issues. And of course, I think reading like, for example, the book I was talking about, Dear Centurion, like the author, Amazing, they talk about this idea that they somehow had to negotiate all of these markets and what it is like to be marginalized personally, but also through their unplaceable kind of genre. So they talk about this, and I found that very, very interesting to think things through about, okay, my own work, especially. And I think it's a really difficult question to answer. I think there needs to be some. Of course, you need to market your book, so sometimes it can be good for an author to say things like, I'm an African futurist, because they've like Nnedi Okorafor, she's, of course, it's legitimate that she's an African futurist. I'm not saying that it's not, again, we talk about legitimacy, but legitimately, she's also a great marketer. That's why she's so successful, because she's at once a great business person as well as being an author. And to be a good author, you need to be a good business person. To be a good academic, you need to be a good business person, actually, like a lot of the time. Unfortunately, this is the way that the capitalist system is and the marketing system is. We have to somehow market ourselves into the categories that are defined. But then, of course, Dear Centurion called for this need of communities within those systems, within those infrastructures. So, you need to find your people, so to speak, that will support you. And I think this is more about a publisher being like, okay, I can't really categorize this, but I'm still going to publish this book, and I'm still going to find a way, and I'm still going to maybe talk about, okay, well, we're not going to categorize it in this way, but we could do it this way. And I think there just takes a little bit more open-mindedness, perhaps. And I think the same in academia is about interdisciplinary, being an interdisciplinary community, about being collegiate, about being like, this is what the author says. And myself as an academic, I need to think about, what does the author say? But also, what's my own positionality? Like, I'm a white British person who is now living abroad, but I am also an academic who needs to talk about the novels. So I have to somehow define them. So there just needs to be a bit more self-awareness of that. So I think it's both about where can we place the author, how can we look differently at genre categorization, but also looking at ourselves and how we view things. And I think in terms of practical kind of ways, the only thing to do this is through like continued literary events. And I think this is where Nnedi Okorafor and Amazing, they've been really successful, for example, by continuously talking about themselves as authors, about how do I define myself. And yes, they are quite often like, even though maybe Nnedi Okorafor's latest book is talking about the death of the author, she is quite present. So it's allowing platforms, I think, would be the most practical way, allowing different platforms. I hope that answers your question. I know it's not 100% practical, but I hope that it at least answers a little bit.
No, thank you.
Oh, I can see you now as well.
So we can see you. Yeah, so I think it's a very good way of so trying to put yourself an identity, finding an identity, and then linking that within a community of practice, which the examples that you have given have actually worked well. So there is that in individual identity plus, how you position yourself within a community of practice in this space that really endears to itself. But that's a very good question, Castellan. So thanks. I think it's been expounded, but if you have any follow-up questions, then maybe we can pick it from there.
No, it's good. I will think about the event thing. I've thought so much about how in genre spaces, things that don't match up with Anglophone fantasy or science fiction traditions often get sort of like pushed aside into this other category.
Correct.
And I think I see it a lot with magical realism. I see it a lot with African fantastic traditions. Yeah, just thinking about how to sort of bring those together more. But thank you for the answer. I appreciate it.
I think to add also, what I also find challenging on that as well is geographical categorizations. But like, you can't always just say this is this is African, or this is. What I hate is also, like, I also get categorized as academic as being African studies or something, but actually speculation exists everywhere. And so I am interdisciplinary, but I'm also looking just at African texts. But also I get asked, why can't you do global South studies, or why can't you do world literary studies? I have to somehow always compare like an Indian text to like a Nigerian text. And I'm always like, okay, that's cool, but I don't necessarily need to all the time. And there seems to be this push towards like global South studies a lot, which I don't like. And it is a problem a lot of the time. So I find it disturbing actually as well. And I feel like, of course, the authors get pushed even more to do things like that, to be, if you're not a Western author, you then just get pushed into, okay, well, you're like something else then. Which is not the case, and also many authors exist between different spaces. So many people have maybe grown up in Nigeria, or they've grown up in the UK, and then they've gone, to Nigeria or to Ghana or to every other, African country. They've moved between different worlds or different, different landscapes, different spaces. So there's always some kind of identity that you cannot contain as one thing. As well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. There's a hand from Jacqueline. She's been waiting patiently. Jacqueline, go ahead and ask your question or comment.
Hi, Dr. Clarke. Thank you so much for that talk. Sort of following on from what we've just been discussing, I think Nnedi Okorafor recently on Blue Sky went on she did this whole long series of posts about how she's being pigeonholed into this thing that she defined, which is African Futurism, and that her latest book is not, in her opinion, African Futurist at all. And this has been really upsetting to her because she is multidimensional and so on. And I wanted to hear your thoughts a bit more about particularly African writers. Sorry, am I not loud enough?
So no, I think it's my computer. Yeah, I'm just making sure I hear you.
Okay. Because I find with African writers that this being stuck into a genre is a big thing for African writers. It's so hard for people to think about African writers in any other way, except to think of them as African writers. And it's always been that way. So even with older African literature, you find that it's always seen as other, as you were just saying. And I was also thinking about futurism in terms of the STEM thing that we're talking about when we're imagining futures. we tend to see African futurism as more a past thinking thing. It's about magic and demons or gods or whatever, and it's more about the past, or it feels like it's more mystical and mythological and about the past. So do you have any thoughts about how we can sort of deal with that? So it's following on from Priscilla's question, I guess, which is about genres, but more about the how not to pigeonhole how African writers can deal. So I'm sorry, you've answered some of this already, and I did put my hand up before all this. But if you have any further thoughts about African writing and futurism and how not to get stuck in this sort of idea of Africans as being from the past.
Yeah, so I think underlying it's been always like this. It's always been that way. In your response, Michelle, why should it not be disrupted? Why should it always be that way? Why?
Yeah. So I mean, there's like I think I have to say, like, yeah, you're right. Like, it is a problem, but what I find fascinating, and it's actually why I like to work with, and have done for a very long time, to work with the genre from like geographically sub-Saharan. So I work less on, I would say, Afrofuturist or texts from the American continent, for example. I really work from texts from sub-Saharan Africa. But what I saw from the beginning of reading these texts was that they defy these notions, even though they keep getting categorized. Especially if you think about like Kojo Lang just blew everything away in his time, and then Nnedi Okorafor now is doing that. And what I loved about The Death of the Author is she has such a wealthy canon. Like, she just writes and writes and writes, and you can see the accumulation of The Death of the Author that book has been for her. Like, I really read it like this is her, I don't know how to call it, like a swan song or what to call it, but it was like this bringing together of all of those little strands that she talks about being a writer, that she brings into her novels, of all the characters, of being a woman, of being, also disabled or marginalized or different. And she somehow managed to make that into, to me, a fantastic text and talk about all of those issues. So it was like, I don't know whether swan song is the right word, but what I mean is, like, it was like an accumulation. I don't know if I'm using the phrase correctly, but basically, I mean, it's like this kind of like beautifully bringing together of everything she was conversing with us for so long as her audience. And then she's also this kind of, what is it to be an African? Because obviously in that text as well, it's an African family who have then moved between different spaces of the Caribbean and the America and the US. So there's some very interesting discussions on then what does it mean to be these things. And I think that the kind of context of African literary history has not been given enough worth or attention by many people, in that it's doing a lot of work that Western genres are not doing, or haven't been doing for a long time. Maybe they're starting to again now, but I really do think they are always breaking boundaries, specifically in this speculative way. And I think that it's a shame this keeps happening, but at the same time, I do think that there are people who break these boundaries, and there's been many examples from the beginning. Like, also I'm thinking of like The Rape of Shavi and things like that, and even like Achebe, like the first, like one of his novels, the first one, it says like, there's like a sci-fi element where there's like an iron horse, of someone like kind of coming in on an iron horse, and it's quite science fictional. So I don't know, I don't think people always notice, but it's always there. And you're right, and why has it always been that way? And that's simply because the system supports that. The infrastructure of the system that we're in, whether it's marketing, publishing, capitalism, it is supporting that. But I do think that these writers are making headway into demolishing those structures. And that's the kind of examples that I've been trying to bring forth today. There's many others also, like The Old Drift, For example, Molly Serpal, that's also very genre bending. I think that's probably one of the most important novels to come out recently from African authors. So there's just many, everything by Wole Talabi, I'm a big fan as well. So especially to do with his work on like AI, it's very interesting. So these writers are really at the forefront of everything that's happening. It's just like you say, it's not always recognized. Yeah. I hope I answered a little bit, but I don't know whether I have a direct answer of why does it keep happening.
Yeah, so I think you've tackled that well, Jacqueline. Does that augur well with with you?
Thank you. I mean, obviously, it's a big topic, and it's not going to be solved in one day. Thank you so much for your thoughts. It's decades, and I mean, there are other things going on that have made this created this problem.
Yeah, but there is hope, and
there is hope. Exactly.
Yeah, there is hope, and what
Thank
Michelle is saying to us today is that there is hope, and yeah, things are happening.
I hope that was the takeaway.
Yeah, I think
thanks very much. Yes.
Sure, thanks, Jacqueline. I think that's our time. Muna, do you want to unmute and ask?
No, I didn't have I didn't have a question. Right. Okay. I just wanted to say this has been a wonderful discussion, and I'm really grateful to your insights, Michelle. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, all the questions are wonderful. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michelle, for giving us today's seminar. The seminar has been recorded, so it will be cascaded across the whole community. And we look forward to maybe having you here again another day to look at a different angle of this and maybe go deeper into the questions that have been asked today. But thank you very much, everyone, for sparing time to be with us and to join with Michelle this afternoon. I wish you all the best and have a good day. God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.